Disclaimer: this is a parody of multiple fictional works. The characters, settings, and events mentioned or depicted herein are used satirically to comment on the conventions, tropes, and absurdities of their respective fictional universes. None of this is intended to infringe upon any existing intellectual property. It's all in good fun, so please enjoy this comedic exaggeration. The trouble began on a perfectly ordinary afternoon in a realm that was decidedly not our own, a realm commonly referred to as Fantasy Land, where capes, spandex, glowing hair, and intangible beams of unimaginable power were an everyday matter of course. It was in this fantastical setting that a bizarre tear in the fabric of spacetime opened, forming a shimmering portal near a quiet forest clearing. Though no one knew exactly how it happened, blame a magical spell gone awry or cosmic whimsy or perhaps a writer's convenience, two mighty heroes came hurtling toward that portal from opposite directions. One, draped in bright red and blue, with a blazing S on his chest, soared like a bullet. The other, clad in orange gi with hair so spiky you could poke an eye out by merely standing too close, zipped forward atop a golden blur of energy. Their names, of course, were Superman and Goku, though in their own worlds, they were so instantly recognizable that introductions were rarely necessary. But in a comedic twist of cosmic mischief, this portal was not going to spit them out into any old dimension or parallel universe. Instead, it cast them headlong into the one place that could not have been more alien or bizarre to them, the real world. Here, all the outlandish powers and comedic, physics-defying feats they took for granted would suddenly appear as utter madness to the average person. And that is precisely what makes this story so entertaining, and, for them, so deeply confusing. As soon as Superman and Goku came tumbling through the portal, they both lost control mid-flight, barreling into one another with a resounding thud. They tumbled, end over end, in a tangle of limbs and cloth, landing in what looked like a nondescript patch of grass. If they had paused to look up, they would have seen the nearest marker of civilization was, in fact, just a short distance away, a local public park in a typical, relatively unremarkable suburban area of Earth, the real-world Earth, that is. When they finally recovered from their accidental collision, they rose to their feet, dusted themselves off, and surveyed their surroundings. "This is weird," muttered Goku, scratching the back of his head. He surveyed the scenery. "Where's Karin Tower? I was just there, and then, poof, I came through that weird portal." His eyes drifted over the horizon. Countless houses and buildings stood in the distance, but none matched the flamboyant architecture or whimsical style he was used to in West City or any of the other regions back home. Instead, these buildings were drab rectangles of brick and cement, with small windows and bland paint jobs. Superman, adjusting the collar of his cape, scanned the horizon with his supervision. A single glance should have been enough to pinpoint the sprawling metropolis of, well, Metropolis, or the shadowy outline of Gotham's skyline. But there was nothing. Not even a sign that might read, Metropolis, 100 miles. He couldn't even find a single mention of Wayne Enterprises, LexCorp, or Star City. It was as though all the familiar reference points of his life had simply evaporated. "This isn't right," Superman said in a low voice. "Something's off. It's as if my entire world just got swallowed up and replaced by this." He gestured at the neat swathe of houses and the monotonous cars passing by. "But that's impossible. I should be able to see the major cities from anywhere if I fly high enough." Goku, in an effort to make sense of things, tried to locate any key signatures he recognized. He closed his eyes, focusing. He expected to sense the comforting energies of Bulma, Vegeta, or even Master Roshi. But this place felt so void of any powerful fighters that it was almost unsettling. "I can't sense anyone," he said, frowning. "No one with a high power level. It's like everyone here is just normal." Superman scanned for kryptonite radiation or any sign of a heartbeat that might belong to Batman, Wonder Woman, or the Flash. His acute hearing should have easily picked up at least a snippet of the usual chaos that accompanied his life, but there was nothing but the low hum of distant traffic and the chirping of birds. Frustrated, he floated a few inches off the ground. "Let's get a better vantage point." They ascended, leaving the small clearing behind and flying toward the nearest open space, a local city park, filled with unsuspecting civilians who, at that very moment, were walking their dogs, playing frisbee, and generally minding their own business. As soon as the two brightly colored heroes touched down, they were met with bewildered stares. A hush fell over the immediate area, and a few dogs stopped barking to cock their heads in confusion. One bold onlooker, wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with the logo of some obscure band, took out his phone and started recording. Goku offered a friendly wave. "Hi," he said, hoping to gather some information from this throng. However, His voice carried such earnestness that it only enhanced the oddity of his already strange appearance, the spiky hair, the orange gi, and the wristbands that looked like relics from some 1980s workout video. Meanwhile, Superman looked around and felt an urgent need to ask directions. "Excuse me," he said politely to an older woman who was guiding a leashed bulldog. "Could you tell me where we are? I'm trying to find Metropolis, or maybe Gotham City if it's closer." The woman blinked several times, eyeing the large S on his chest, the bright red trunks, and then the regal, flowing cape. "Metropolis? Gotham? Are you guys on your way to a comic convention or something?" At that comment, a few other bystanders took interest, leaning in to get a better view. One smirking teenager whispered to his friend, "Dude, that's some retro spandex. It looks like those old exercise outfits from the 80s. Did he forget the leg warmers?" Overhearing this, Superman's cheeks reddened slightly. He'd heard occasional jests before. Lois Lane had teased him about the bright colors once or twice, but never had an entire crowd glowered at him with such blatant confusion, nor had he ever heard someone call his iconic outfit an 80s exercise outfit. Then the insults shifted to Goku. "What's up with that hair?" asked a bald man standing a few steps away. "It's so spiky and rigid it looks like plastic." A middle-aged woman in yoga pants chimed in, "He must use at least a gallon of hair gel. I can't even see any stray strands." The bystanders, most of whom were simply bored, smartphone-toting civilians, found it hilarious that these men, who obviously thought of themselves as big shots with superpowers, were decked out in ridiculous costumes. Goku scratched his head again, utterly at a loss. He was used to folks in his own world occasionally poking fun at his hair, but this was different. It was as though these real-world inhabitants had never seen anything like it. Indeed, to them, Goku's hair was on par with a cartoon character's, something that, in real-world physics, made no sense. Feeling the sting of the crowd's mockery, Goku turned to Superman. "These people sure have a lot to say about us," he said quietly. "I don't know if I like it here." Superman, trying to mask his irritation, responded, "I'm not used to being ridiculed like this, either. Usually, people cheer. Sometimes they run in terror, but they never just laugh." A couple of small children were pointing and giggling. One of them said, "Mommy, that man's hair doesn't move at all. It's like a piece of plastic on his head." Another pointed at Superman's chest and asked, "Why is he wearing underpants on the outside?" The murmurs escalated, and Goku, whose pride had been moderately dented, decided that was enough. "I'm going to find somewhere else to think. Maybe if we fly out of here, we'll see something more like what we're used to." Superman nodded in agreement. "Yes. Let's." He paused and glanced over the crowd. "Fly," he finished, though it suddenly occurred to him that if these people were so baffled by a costume, they might have an even bigger reaction to actual flight. Sure enough, as soon as Superman's boots rose from the ground, and Goku seemed to levitate by virtue of sheer ki, the crowd collectively gasped. A handful of people shrieked, nearly dropping their phones. One or two exclaimed in disbelief, "They're flying. They're actually flying." A sweaty jogger paused mid-stride, panting. "What in the world? How are they doing that? There's no jetpack, no harness. Is this some kind of elaborate prank?" "Maybe they're filming a movie," someone else said. "But I don't see any cameras or wires." Superman exchanged a look with Goku, and then they both ascended higher, hoping to put distance between themselves and the confused, and borderline hostile, crowd. Once in the air, they took stock of the landscape from above. It was unremarkable: standard roads, standard buildings, the usual suburban sprawl. There was not a single skyscraper with a large Daily Planet globe on top. No precariously perched lookout tower. Nothing that screamed this is a world of wonders. "Goku," Superman said with a concerned frown, "I don't think these people have ever seen superpowers before. It's like they believe it's impossible." Goku sighed, slouching as he hovered in the air. "That's so sad. No big tournaments, no flashy key battles, no random alien invasions to liven things up? It does look miserable." Superman's mind raced. No one to protect them from natural disasters or criminals. This is definitely not a comic book universe. This is, I don't even know how to describe it. It's almost like some bleak reflection of existence where no one can do anything beyond the ordinary. Goku clasped his hands behind his head, perplexed. "You know, back in my world, we at least have Kami, the guardian of Earth, living in a big tower high above the clouds. If these folks don't have a guardian or a tower, they probably don't even have Dragon Balls." Down below, a few of the onlookers tried to follow the conversation, though they could only catch fragments since Goku and Superman were drifting higher. But what they did hear was enough to instill panic. Godless? No guardian? No magical or alien protectors? One large man with a thick mustache cried, "Wait, does that mean we have no one watching over us? Are we truly alone? No heroes at all? This is terrible." Another bystander, equally shaken, yelled, "Goku, we need your help. If you're a god in your world, can you become one here? If it's that easy, maybe you can protect us." A chorus of anxious voices rose, some shouting for guidance, others lamenting how unexceptional their existence was, how vulnerable they felt all of a sudden. For indeed, to them, the idea of living in a dull world without the safety net of superpowered protectors was hitting home. They had never even realized it was a possibility, because it was never a question, such things weren't real, or so they believed. But now, faced with super beings from elsewhere, they felt the unmistakable sting of existential dread. Goku rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, I do have a few forms that relate to being a god. Ever hear of Super Saiyan God, or Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, or Ultra Instinct, though that's not exactly a god form, but hey, semantics." He paused. "Maybe I can do something." Superman's ears perked up at the conversation below. "Hold on, Goku. Are we really going to set ourselves up as their heroes? We don't even know how we got here. For all we know, we might be able to find a way back soon." But Goku's face lit up. "Hey, it's not just about being their hero. If there are no decent fighters around here, I might get bored, but if I'm recognized as a god, maybe some of them will want to train, and eventually I'll get a good fight out of it." Several of the eavesdropping civilians below heard exactly that portion, "I'll get a good fight out of it." They looked at each other with alarm. Is their new god hoping to pick fights? Meanwhile, Superman scratched his chin, thinking about all the potential ways to create a superhero. "In my world, we have speedsters, vigilantes, cosmic defenders, demigods, billionaires with fancy suits, entire alien races. Some got their powers through accidents, others through intense training, or even just winning the genetic lottery. If there truly are none here, maybe I can help replicate some origin stories. If I just get a few of them started, we'll have a brand new Justice League in no time." He was speaking more to himself than to Goku, but the sentiment was apparent. Goku snickered, "Now that's an idea, Superman. You do that while I see about becoming this Earth's new god. If we can't get back home right away, we might as well do something interesting." And so, in a moment that would prove fateful for the real world, our two heroes parted ways in the sky, each determined to solve the real world's lack of excitement problem in his own manner. Goku soared off to find some high-altitude vantage point or maybe a large temple, convinced that if none existed, he'd simply declare a random mountain peak his new domain. Superman, on the other hand, flew to a bustling city center, looking for an ordinary man or woman who might be coaxed into superheroic greatness. The next several days proved to be a chaotic spree of ill-advised experimentation. Superman, who was certain that duplicating famous accidents from his own universe was a surefire method of spawning new heroes, found a lonely laboratory on the outskirts of town. He reasoned, if it worked for Barry Allen, it should work for someone else. "I just need the right chemicals, a little lightning, and a victim, volunteer." Persuading someone to stand in a lab, doused with questionable chemicals while waiting for a lightning bolt, was no easy task. But Superman eventually convinced one hapless soul, an ambitious scientist with illusions of grandeur who had read too many comic books, into the experiment. The outcome was a spectacular disaster. The poor man was struck by lightning, yes, but instead of acquiring super speed, he suffered severe burns, requiring immediate hospitalization. Alarmed and guilt-ridden, Superman visited him in the hospital, only to find the man's family was furious. "You said he'd become the fastest man alive," they cried. "Now he can't even move his arms." As if that wasn't bad enough, Superman, undaunted, sought other strategies. He found a wealthy young socialite who had a pre-existing interest in archery, someone who might just be the real world's Oliver Queen. So, Superman arranged for this man's private yacht to accidentally run aground on a deserted island. He'll be forced to fend for himself, Superman thought, and return as a hardened vigilante, champion of his city. In reality, the man nearly starved to death within a week. When he was finally rescued, he was traumatized, not emboldened. He said to Superman, through chattering teeth, "Are you insane? I had to eat bugs. No, thanks. I'm not fighting crime for you, or for anybody else." The final straw came when Superman located an affluent couple and their child, walking through a dark alley after a fine evening at the opera. "If I position some petty criminal to rob them," he started, the rationale being to replicate the tragic origin of Batman. But the real-world criminal who stepped in had no patience for dramatic monologues or symbolic gunshots in the air. He mugged them at knife point. The father tried to resist and was indeed fatally stabbed, while the mother managed to flee, leaving the child behind, traumatized. It was a horrific event, with no neat stage lights or cinematic flourish. Real violence was anything but a tidy catalyst for heroism. Superman, shell-shocked by what he had brought about, quietly rescued the child, feeling the heavy weight of guilt. Maybe in a decade or two, he might become something like Batman, he whispered in a hollow voice, but at what cost? I never meant for it to be so, real. Meanwhile, Goku was off on his own comedic spree of mischief, having dubbed himself the new Guardian of Earth. He announced it from the top of a tall skyscraper in one of the major cities, calling out to the crowd below, "People of Earth, this Earth, listen up. I'm Son Goku, your new god. That means you can rely on me for basically anything you need, and if there's someone tough out there, please challenge me." He grinned from ear to ear, brimming with excitement. The crowd wasn't entirely sure how to react. Some gazed upward in awe, some rolled their eyes, some tried to record the event for social media. A handful of eager individuals actually started forming cult-like gatherings, building small shrines to Goku in hopes of receiving divine protection, or, at the very least, a cameo on his next televised pronouncement. Word spread rapidly, and soon Goku found himself confronted by a flurry of demands. People wanted cures for diseases, an end to world hunger, solutions to environmental crises, free housing, help with traffic, you name it. Goku found it all quite overwhelming. In his world, being a deity figure was more about looking after the planet's safety and fighting off universal threats, not playing cosmic butler to billions of needy supplicants. And while he was certainly strong enough to do astonishing feats, he was not exactly adept at worldly politics, nor did he have the patience to handle endless bureaucratic complaints. He was a fighter first and foremost. In an attempt to mollify his brand new worshippers, Goku asked, "So, where's your best martial artist? I'd like to see how strong you real-world folk can be." But these real-world inhabitants hardly had an answer. Mixed martial arts champions and Olympic athletes were fairly ordinary from Goku's perspective. He'd flick them away with a single finger if they tried to fight him. "Come on," he'd protest, "isn't there anyone with even a fraction of my power around here?" When the response was invariably no, Goku tried to teach some martial arts. He opened up temporary dojos, encouraging people to gather for training sessions, promising that if they worked hard enough, maybe they'd experience something akin to power levels. After weeks of intense push-ups and squats, no one was firing ki blasts. Some folks claimed they felt healthier, but that was about it. It wasn't enough for Goku, who pined for a real challenge. And so, in a bored moment of wanting more out of his new role, Goku took to gliding around from city to city, munching on the free offerings of food his worshippers provided. Fried chicken, pizza, gourmet burgers, fancy pastries, he devoured them all. Still, his appetite for combat went unsatiated. Eventually, the dissatisfaction among the real-world populace grew. Many had pinned their hopes on Superman's heroic scenario building, but his attempts were going disastrously wrong. People were getting hurt, sometimes even fatally, and no one was emerging with powers. Meanwhile, Goku was just flying around, sampling local cuisines, solving the occasional minor traffic accident by lifting cars out of the way, but ignoring the deeper systemic problems that plague society. Most real-world problems, poverty, disease, political corruption, were unaffected by giant blasts of ki. And so, the new god of Earth was starting to look like a man in an orange costume who just wanted a good brawl. The frustrated citizens began to complain. They marched in droves, carrying signs that read "Ban superpower stunts. We don't want accidental origins, and feed the poor, not the saints." Some blamed Superman directly for the misguided attempts at vigilante creation. Others blamed Goku for focusing too much on personal excitement over actual governance. As social media swelled with accusations, conspiracy theories, and angry hashtags, Goku's fledgling group of worshippers muttered that maybe it wasn't so great to have a casual deity after all. Meanwhile, many humbler folks lamented that if this world could have been a fraction as interesting as the fantasy worlds, maybe they'd have better solutions to their problems. Goku, perched on the edge of a well-lit billboard, listened to the growing discontent from below. "Oh man," he mumbled, "they're mad at me." But he also caught repeated mentions of that guy in the cape who's messing around and hurting people. A bright grin began to form across his face. If they're mad at Superman, maybe that means he's gotten stronger from all his misadventures? If so, he'd be a worthy opponent. And that thought, true to Goku's character, lit a spark of excitement in him. He was about to get the fight he craved. At the same time, Superman, weighed down by guilt, soared above the city at night. He observed the chaos his meddling had wrought. People felt more powerless than ever, now that they saw superpowers truly were not going to happen for them. Some were depressed, some furious, and the child who had lost his father in the alley might or might not become the real-world Batman, though not before years of therapy and institutional care. Superman flinched at the memory of the man he'd inadvertently electrocuted. Am I the villain here? He asked himself, drifting among the stars. I wanted to help them, to give them hope. But this place doesn't work like a comic book. Things are too real. Tragedies are final, not catalysts for costumed heroics. From the streets below, a thunderous cheer rose, followed by a swirl of energy. Goku had arrived, perched on top of a building, arms crossed. A group of onlookers fled, screaming. It's that so-called God guy. He's about to do something crazy. Indeed, in the real world, two superpowered titans squaring off was the stuff of big-budget films, not everyday life. Superman lowered himself, landing across from Goku on an empty stretch of road. The streetlights flickered over them, and there was an electric tension in the air. With a flourish, Goku dropped into a fighting stance. Superman, he said, I've been hearing you've been messing things up. People are complaining to me left and right. But more importantly, I'm bored out of my mind here, and I need a decent match. He flashed his signature grin. You in? Superman stared, torn by moral conflict. People might get hurt if we go all out. The infrastructure here isn't built for godlike power. We can't just exchange punches like we would in our own worlds. But Goku's eyes gleamed with battle lust. We'll go somewhere else if we need to. Right now, I just want to see how strong you are. He wasn't trying to be malicious, this was his nature. Yet it was precisely that nature that could spell doom for an unsuspecting, powerless planet. Urged on by Goku's challenge, and weighed down by his own frustrations, Superman clenched his fists. Perhaps a good old-fashioned brawl would let him vent. All right, he said grimly. But not here, let's fly to the desert. At least the collateral damage will be minimal. They took off in twin streaks of color, leaving onlookers gaping in awe. Within minutes, they'd arrived at a vast desert expanse, miles from civilization. The horizon was flat and empty, dotted only by tumbleweeds and the occasional coyote. The real-world watchers who had the means to follow them via helicopter or drone soared overhead, broadcasting the showdown live on every conceivable platform. The entire planet was glued to screens, hearts pounding in both trepidation and excitement. Was this truly about to happen, two unstoppable powerhouses fighting in their world? Goku wasted no time. With a flare of his ki, his hair shifted from black to a fiery red, his eyes glimmering with godly power. Superman felt the shockwave, nearly stumbling as the ground cracked beneath Goku's feet. If any real-world geologists had been around, they'd be flabbergasted by the phenomenon, a single man generating more seismic force than the largest of machines. Even from tens of miles away, cameras recorded the air shimmering around Goku. I'm warming up, Goku declared. Let's see if you can handle this. Superman's jaw tightened. He braced himself, calling forth the full extent of his Kryptonian might. This was not the relatively sanitized environment of a comic book panel but the real world, where catastrophic destruction had no retcon. Still, the fight was on. They launched at each other in a blur, fists connecting with thunderous booms that rang across the desert. Sand whipped into cyclones from the shockwaves. Every blow resonated in the sky like cosmic thunder, fracturing the clouds overhead. Each time Superman blocked one of Goku's punches, entire dunes were flattened by the ensuing gusts of force. When Goku ducked under a swing from Superman, the partial mist still sliced through the air, generating localized sonic booms that rattled the cameras in the news helicopters overhead. All around the planet, viewers watched in terror and awe. Some prayed that one of them would back down. Others cheered for the spectacle, finally, something to break the monotony of everyday life. But the power being unleashed was rapidly spiraling out of control. The color of Goku's aura shifted again, from red to blue, a sign that he'd tapped into the powers of Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, or Super Saiyan Blue. With that transformation, his energy soared. The ground cratered beneath him, forming a basin that stretched for miles. Superman, refusing to yield, unleashed a barrage of heat vision. The searing beams carved molten trails in the desert, but Goku dashed aside, took aim with a Kamehameha wave, and in a surge of adrenaline, fired. The resulting energy clash tore open the desert floor, releasing unimaginable heat and force. The tectonic plates beneath them, never meant to endure such a cosmic-level assault, began to shift violently. In a matter of minutes, fissures spread across continents. Tsunamis were triggered in distant oceans. The very fabric of space-time seemed to groan as these two cosmic anomalies clashed in a world ill-equipped for their might. At a certain point, cameras broadcasting the fight blinked out, satellites went dark, entire cities flickered as power grids overloaded. The real world was on the brink of annihilation, and still the combat raged. Some said later that the final blow was Goku's ultimate attack colliding with Superman's unstoppable momentum. Others insisted that the universe itself had simply had enough, that the cosmic laws could not withstand the presence of beings so anathema to its fundamental banality. Whichever the cause, the universe tore open like fragile cloth, and reality shattered. In the final cataclysmic moment, a bright, soundless explosion enveloped everything. Not just the desert, not just the planet, but the entire cosmos. Galaxies whited out, stars winked away, and existence itself collapsed in on itself in an impossibly swift cosmic meltdown. It was the death of an entire universe, undone by two unstoppable forces that never should have been there in the first place. People across the real world had barely enough time to scream before all went black. And then, just as suddenly, the darkness receded. Goku and Superman found themselves not in a desolate cosmic void, but in the very forest clearing where they had first run into each other, except it was back in fantasy land. The portal swirled shut behind them, leaving the real world, or what was left of it, behind. Dazed, they looked around, blinking in the gentle sunlight. The sky overhead was that whimsical swirl of cartoonish clouds. The smell of fantasy wildflowers lingered on the breeze. Nearby, the local fauna, small dragon-like creatures or magical rabbits, scurried about, paying them no mind. For a moment, the two heroes simply stared at each other. Their minds spun with the memory of an entire world that had been so dull and yet so fragile, undone by their powers. Could it have been real? Goku was the first to speak. That was one crazy dream, right? He forced a chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. No way we actually ended up in a world with no superpowers, no guardians, no nothing, right? And you tried to create heroes, and I tried being a god, that's insane. He laughed again, but a hint of uncertainty lingered in his eyes. Superman hovered a few inches off the ground, scanning the surroundings. The geometry of this forest was too perfect, too animated. There was a castle on the horizon that floated on a cloud, typical of Fantasyland's flamboyant architecture. He sighed, an odd mixture of relief and regret. It certainly felt real, though. Those people, with their plain existence, their lack of wonders, their fear of everything that we do as a matter of course, it was so different. It felt more like a bizarre nightmare or some cautionary tale. Neither wanted to delve too deeply into the moral ramifications of what they'd experienced. The realness of the real world had been jarring, and the final destructive brawl weighed heavily on both. However, the last vestiges of memory slipped from them with every passing second. Already, their minds were rationalizing it away. Perhaps it was some illusion, a shared delusion, something conjured by a mischievous wizard or a cosmic anomaly. Maybe it was better left unexamined. Should we tell anyone about it? Goku wondered aloud. Superman glanced at him, then up at the cloud castle. No, he decided softly. It's probably best we keep it to ourselves. People here wouldn't even believe us. And so, the two parted ways. Superman flew off in search of the next big crisis that might threaten the DC universe. Goku tapped two fingers to his forehead, preparing to teleport to Bulma's place, already anticipating the hearty meal that would greet him and maybe, if he was lucky, a new training challenge with Vegeta. Within minutes, both men were back to their usual routines, saving or endangering their fictional worlds in the delightfully over-the-top manner that was so integral to their existence. Meanwhile, in the ephemeral place that had been the real world, time marched on without them. Perhaps, in some metaphysical sense, the universe had reconstituted itself, as if none of the fiasco ever happened. Or perhaps it remained broken, shards floating in the void. We'll never know for certain. All that is left to say is that in a realm of imagination, anything can happen, and sometimes, collisions of fantasy and reality can be catastrophic. That day, whether real or dream, served as a comedic testament to how truly absurd our favorite fictional heroes can be when thrust into a world that operates by the mundane laws of physics, economics, and common sense, and how unspeakably dull our own reality can seem when measured against the neon brilliance of a comic book or anime universe. After all was said and done, the collision of realities underscored a biting truth. If fantasy were real, it might be too dangerous, too calamitous, for ordinary folks to survive. And if reality had more fantasy, it might just be too exhilarating, too risky, for its stolid populace to handle. Though Goku and Superman resumed their normal lives without further thought, the ephemeral lesson remains for us. Maybe it's best that they stay in their pages and panels, their episodes and arcs, leaving our humdrum reality to remain unremarkable, and safe, by comparison.